Oh, Jesus.
Okay, that wasn't staged acting or anything.
Oh my goodness. Oh my. Oh man.
I've been waiting my whole life to see this.
Never thought I would see it.
Yeah.
It doesn't get bigger and better than that. That is the B-17.
All right, don't. So essentially, we're now at a wrap in our B-17 series Memphis Belle in-depth description of the aircraft. And unfortunately, on the day during our museum trip, we couldn't access the rear end of the aircraft for several reasons. One being that it was not possible to fit one of us plus the cameraman in the tail to film much of the demonstration of the station. But we do have some B-roll footage, so for the majority of this video is going to be mostly voiceover discussion on the tail of the Memphis Belle in particular. Essentially, it's obviously a single-man crew position, and he would have been an enlisted serviceman as well, having completed the aerial gunnery course of training prior to coming into the tail. His sitting position is more or less a kneeling type spot, which seems to be crammed up with your knees bent like that for 8+ hours. Seems to be like one of the more uncomfortable positions to be in the plane for that duration. And then he would sit on top of a bicycle seat, which would be able to be adjusted somewhat. Essentially, there were two types of tail turret, if you will, inside the B-17. The one you see here in the Memphis Belle is the earlier style, which is referred to as the Stinger tail. And about 65% of B-17s constructed had this style of tail. And then there was a later upgrade called the Cheyenne tail turret, because it was modified, or the components manufactured in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and about 35% of the late war B-17s manufactured had this style of tail turret. Sighting was very simple for the Stinger type tail. The gunner had more or less a sight post for obvious reasons. The first being that he cannot access down behind the guns directly to sight them in. And secondly, the nature of the tail just would not allow for that type of setup. And early on, even still with the manual type of set for the firing aiming device, there was not even an optical sight available, but that was later upgraded with the Cheyenne turret.
Some of the Memphis Belle's like worst hits, worst damage, like highlight missions, if you will.
Okay, so let's see. The Memphis Belle and its crew had several consequential missions. The first one probably was their second mission on the 9th of November, and they were flying at 10,000 feet, and 10,000 feet was not normal. They always flew above 20,000 feet, but this kind of alludes to the experimentation that was happening. Leaders thought, well, if we fly at a lower altitude, we might get shot up, but if we destroy the target, we don't have to go back to it, so maybe that will be better. So they went in at 10,000 feet, and it turned out to be a bad idea. And a lot of airplanes got hit, airplanes got shot down. In the case of the Memphis Belle, they got hit in their number one engine, knocked that engine out. So that was really shocked them into, okay, you're in combat now. So I'd say probably the most consequential mission was in January of 1943. They were flying on a mission against Lorient, and they got attacked by an FW-190, and it just raked them. It broke the plexiglass in the front, put two big holes in the tail, one in the vertical, one in the rudder. It shredded the right elevator. Thankfully, no one was injured. I don't know how, But what we're looking at here is this is that tail being replaced. So the tail that's on the Memphis Belle today is not the tail that it went over to England with. It was replaced, and this is the process of it being replaced. This is a copy of the damage report by the Memphis Belle's crew chief, Joe Jambrone. So they had this blank form, and if airplane came in damaged, the crew chief would jot down where the damage was. So we can see explosive shell, that's the 2 big holes, small machine gun, we got explosive shell. So these are cannon shells from the FW-190, also some flak hits on the horizontal. But that's the most damage that the Memphis Belle received.
Wow.
And then I would say probably another consequential mission was when John Quinlan was hit, and he was hit in March of 1943, hit in the thigh. Most likely probably a fighter attack. It could have been flak. The sources kind of conflict.
And we're standing right under it, essentially. You can even see, they pointed out to us before, and then on the other side, the different colored tail. And you guys even brought that out in the restoration to show that.
So we did a very close study using different color schemes. It was kind of challenging because in the color footage, it depends on the daylight at the time, and the colors go all over the place. But even without the tail being replaced, which of course it was, since that tail was produced at a different location as a sub-assembly, there's no way to have paint match perfectly.
Right.
So if you look at B-17s of that time, that vertical is always just a little bit different shade of olive drab. It's on every airplane, but the fact that it was a replacement tail, it definitely was a different shade. And we also see a different shade of olive drab on the control surfaces.
Other than the guns themselves, he had the same basic kit as basically anyone in the plane, with his communications and his flight heated suit plugs, and then his oxygen lines running to the back of the plane. Much like the rest of the crews, the guns were the A&M2s, aircraft configured 50 cals, and the tail turret position held 565 rounds, located in the 2 bins behind the tail gunner. There was some armor in the tail, mostly more or less an armor plate that would fold out of the way during servicing, and then during flight it would fold down in front of the guns and protect the whole front of the tail gunner, and he would reach around the side of the armor plate to access the guns. And then his forward glass panel was armored, but the glass around the sides was not. In the ring sight sighting system, with the effective range of the guns being about 600 yards in the tail position here, the gradical pattern was designed to feature the aircraft being first sighted in at that effective range, with from wingtip to wingtip straight on, a full picture of the plane inside that total ring sight would place the plane at about 150 yards out. The tail turret position was considered by fighter pilots from the German side one of the deadliest spots to approach the plane for several reasons. The first being that the duration that you are on the approach is the longest of any of the approach angles you can take on the plane, flying into a B-17 formation. And then secondly, the deflection angle is the least for the tail turret, with being straight on more or less and only 1 or 2 rads off. So that was considered one of the most effective gun stations in the plane. Therefore, the fighter aircraft would not approach them as often. However, there were some tactics noted with the trails left behind from the engines that the planes would often approach hiding inside those trails because visibility was limited for the tail gunners at that time. The tail turret also had what was more or less a removable plexiglass graph that would indicate a drift angle of the tail, which was an aid in navigation. So he could slip this piece of glass perspex graph into his sight glass, use the gun sights to aim at a known reference target on the ground, and then convert the drift angle to report to the navigator. The tail turrets also featured deflector shields, which were a muzzle device only featured on the chin turret and the tail turret. The reason for this is that the gun muzzles are located so close together that essentially this would create disturbance from the recoil or the exiting gases out of one barrel, disturbing the flight path of the projectile coming out of the barrel on the other side. These muzzle deflectors were not necessary on the ball turret or the top turret, as the guns were considered far enough apart to avoid this. The only other features that the tail turret really has would be the lighting system that was used for the toggle ears. So if you look back to our Bombardier series of the B-17, there's a discussion of how that works. Essentially, the white light being on would indicate it's time for all the planes in the rear of that plane to open their bomb bay doors, and then the red light would come on indicating a bomb release.
So these lights that we're looking on the back, we're actually seeing a modification that was done in theater, and it's something that we'd never quite been able to figure out exactly why. So normally a B-17 would have a red and white light, and they're used to signal, but this multi-light assembly that's here is actually a British system. It's a British identification system, and they could turn it, and that would be a way, basically identification friend or foe, particularly at night. And for whatever reason, this was modified and put on the Memphis Belle. We don't know exactly why. And so that is actually a British system, and that is a reproduction of it. The restoration staff built that from scratch from original drawings of that British identification system.
As far as defense goes, as the tail being one of the most effective gunnery stations in the plane, the chin turret on the G model may also be considered effective in that nature. However, the time of duration for the aircraft to be head on to the plane, as opposed to coming in from behind it, is significantly decreased. So that still leaves the tail as one of the most effective gun stations. The tail turret gunner also had his own access door that could be jettisoned during a bailout drill, and this was placed here because this would allow him to bail out at a faster pace, as opposed to having to scale around the side of the retracted tail wheel during the bailout, which would have been a costly time to conduct this.
Now, those devotees of the Memphis Belle would notice that on the war bond tour there were 8 swastikas painted under the bombs. So where does that extra one come from? Well, that's courtesy of John Quinlan, the tail gunner. He was sure that he shot down a German fighter on a mission early in his tour. Sure he was. He was not given official credit for it. He even painted on a swastika on the top of the tail.
Oh, man.
And though I haven't found evidence that he was ordered to take it off there, it was very clearly painted over. And that's been duplicated for the restoration.
Wow.
And what's funny is he did get one credited kill, but in his mind he shot down 2 German fighters. So when they started adding the publicity markings later, he was sure to add another swastika to the tail. So that's where that 8th one comes from.
Zach took us all the way through the Belle. One last time, just tell us what this means to you and this country.
Well, so this airplane means a lot to me. It's a representative for all of the men who flew and fought and died doing the bombing campaign over Europe. It was the 8th Air Force lost more men killed in action than the entire Marine Corps during World War II. So it was a very costly mission, but an important one. And this is an embodiment of all the sacrifice that those men had to go through. So it's a very special airplane. It's a centerpiece for the museum to have the Memphis Belle here.
Well, I want to say what it means to us and what it's going to mean for the viewers to see the level of depth we've dived into, and we couldn't have achieved that without the museum's support and to you for taking us through the plane. So I want to shake your hand.
Oh, of course, man.
I really appreciate it.
Of course.
And maybe we'll do it again on any number of these other aircraft, but I think the Belle was the best place to start.
I agree. I couldn't agree more.
It means a lot. So thank you.
Yep, sure thing, man.
All right. restoring an aircraft is no easy feat, and as an expert in restoration myself, I would have to say this is one of the most beautiful, pristine, amazing restorations I have ever seen. Additionally, nose art is one of the things that calls to people, and a subject a lot of people are very interested in. And this nose art right here is probably the first example of nose art almost anyone is going to see.
I believe the artwork was done stateside before they went to Europe.
Really?
The trouble of finding an actual good straight-on picture of the nose art was very, very difficult. It's always from far away, there's always at an angle a bunch of people standing there by it, so it's hard to get the true nose art.
And we're going to interview and talk with the guys who recreated this and learn how they did it and what it meant to them to recreate the nose art on one of the most prevalent aircraft in aviation history. Like and subscribe and follow for more.